And we are live. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And this morning, part 5 of my series on Synarchy. Well, it's good to have you with me. With us, Robert, Melissa, Christy, Corky. John is unpacking our structural historical ills one episode at a time. Our society requires therapeutic intervention, just like the wayward adolescent that it is. Improvement is always obvious. Well, thank you very much, Corky, for that little summary. Hey, David's here. Excellent. So this morning, I have been very, very busy doing research into more and more aspects of what might as well be called the synarchy, as you know, archy means government or control, and sin means together. But it also has the effect of a darkness, of a sinful archy, which I think is very appropriate when we consider what they've been doing behind the scenes. I'm calling them the third force, where you see a battle between the Allies and the Axis. They're the third force. Where it's between the West and the Soviets, they're the third force. Where it's between U.S. and Russia or U.S. and China, they are the third force. And the third force is secret, and they're the ones that have the power to pass information back and forth between the other two parties to help or hinder as they see fit to make actually themselves into the Iago character in Shakespeare's Othello, the one that uses deceit, deception, all the Machiavellian tactics that we hear of against everyone else to make himself the winner in the end. What does he win? Well, that's a good question. He gets to uh, feel like a victor. He gets to own things and people. But, that's for only for people that have such a limited vision of what life is and don't appreciate the miracle of life and don't appreciate the incredible privilege that we have to be here, just to be here, breathing in and out. So we have to take a step back and be grateful. And I try to do that every day, being grateful for my health, being grateful for my family, grateful for life. Gracias a la vida, as the song says. And, you know, to life, but let's remember that life is a, a gift, and it's not something to be abused. Well, as I say, I've been roaming around the internet and also buying a bunch of books, as I always do. And thank you for the Patreons, guys. I think I bought maybe 10 books already in January. So you guys really do help me do my research because I can't work without my books. So thanks for your assistance over there at screamingospreys.com. You can go to the Patreon button if you haven't, or if you have a chance to toss a couple bucks into the pile so that we can keep our library growing. The Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr. Memorial Library keeps growing, and we bought bookshelves and lights, and it's going to be very, very nice. I'm looking forward to putting it together and maybe doing a video showing everybody what we've accomplished in terms of creating a library in memory of my dad. Hey, Patacorn, glad you're here. I'm sorry. I don't know how notifications really work. Generally, I put the show up about an hour before, and then I rush over to Twitter to put out a notice. I didn't do it until maybe half hour before this time, but it's not necessarily YouTube's fault. It could be just John trying to do too many things at once. I'm sorry for that. But anyway, everybody's here and we are ready to get started. Thank you for being here. And let's get into this a new source that I found. As I say, I've been roaming around, and I think this is uh, definitely a new source that I want to recommend to everyone to check out. And I'm actually going to show it up on the screen here. Okay, there we are. It's called the McClory's blog. McClaughry is their name. It's a husband and wife, and they have quite a extensive online library they've created. I think the the idea of so many people all over the world have been studying this that I haven't even heard of yet. And this is an example of somebody that's really been digging into it. I haven't really learned who they are very well, except for that they appear to have been deeply affected by the Scientology movement, and they got enlightened by seeing through the Scientology movement. Some family member may have been involved or hurt by it. I'm not sure yet, but the context of their work shows me that they're very, very serious about studying synarchy or the deep state. So, without further ado, let me go on through this particular entry of theirs called the World Commerce Corporation, a history. And this is a an effort on my part to flesh out not only our sources but also our understanding, because when we read in our other sources about things that go together like Operation Gladio and the CIA, for instance, we may not be reading about this particular aspect of it, which is huge. So we need to bring this into our study, and I thank the McClaughreys for their work. Virginia McClaughry has written this particular one. And I'm going to skip through some of the early documentation in history. There were such corporations were created right after World War One, and although it's interesting to trace them through to World War Two, I'm going to skip that and leave that for you to study. And let's move on to the next section, which is called the Nazis. Now, I'm going to leave the reading, the part up there that I'm reading on the screen for you. Um, David's got something there. Operation Snow White was a criminal conspiracy by the Church. Interesting. Um, Snow White is actually the subject of one of Sean Ross's most recent videos. I think is one of the subjects he does in like a 2 hour video. So he's got a lot of stuff in there. But Schneewittchen in German, Snow White is a symbol uh, that i- goes back into the German folklore, and he associates that legend with us with Switzerland. He calls Swissy, of course. But anyway, Snow White and Switzerland tied together by Sean Ross in his most recent one over at Giureh, Giureh, on YouTube. And I do recommend his work, especially if you go back and look at his early ones called Switzerland, Home of the Beast, and The Pharaoh Show. Those are very enlightening, maybe 10, 12 years old now. Okay, back to our subject. I'm going to go over to the main page, but I'm going to keep it like this so you can see the text, and there's some pictures. You can see Pacelli, who became Pius XII. He's the one in the foreground, and then behind him is Pius the 11th, somebody I did not study much, but we're gonna all learn some more about him as I read this morning. Okay, the Nazis. Next, in order to really understand the true purpose and function of the World Commerce Corporation, or the WCC, incorporated in Panama on August 13th, 1945, and where we cross into the people involved, it is necessary to understand a bit of the back history involved with some of the more prominent members of it, such as William Donovan, William Stevenson, and Charles Jocelyn Hambro. The first thing that you need to understand is that these same people were deeply involved in actually directly orchestrating both Nazi Germany and the resulting war, World War II. Okay, we've covered that in other shows. If you aren't there yet, then this is where maybe you need to stop and consider, because what I've come to believe is that World War II was in fact started not by the Hitler and the Fuhrer and his egotistical desire to conquer, but in fact by the same deep state that we talk about today. And that's our that's a summary of what I would say you're going to find about World War I, World War II. All the wars of the 20th century were run by the banks, for the banks, and to the profit of the banks. Top people in both the two main factions of what we call the slave masters were beyond duplicitous in their public demonstrations of concern versus what they were actually doing behind the scenes. For example, Eugenio, let's just call him Eugenio Pacelli, Secretary of State, that is head of their espionage department, under Pope Pius the 11th, who then became Pope himself as Pope Pius the 12th. I call Pacelli's boss Mr. quote, the world has to suffer, because of lovely little gems like this, see below, that are literally God's law simply because he said them. Thanks to Pacelli's work to get the Pope's views to be viewed as part of what's called the magisterium, which meant that, quote, all faithful Catholics are bound to accept these revealed truths with a divine faith, unquote. Remember, and if you don't remember, let me just tell you that Pope Pius the Ninth was the Pope during the first two-thirds or so of the 19th century. And he was the guy that was robbed of his temporal power by when the Italian Revolution came. They took away the papal states. And he, in 1870, according to the uh, the papal encyclicum that he published, declared himself to be infallible, and that's what we're talking about here is the extension of Pope Pius the Ninth's infallibility into a doctrine that all faithful Catholics are bound to accept. Okay, Pacelli, when he and his mentor drew up the enforcement document for Vatican I in 1870, the Code of Canon Law, they'd laid down the law that the Pope, simply by reason of his office as vicar of Christ and as pastor of the entire Christian Church, has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole Church and by divine institution, meaning God said so. The Pope has supreme, full, immediate, and universal power in the care of souls. Packaged in a single manual, the Code of Canon Law was distributed in 1917 to Catholic bishops and clergy throughout the world, especially in Germany. Here's a picture of future Pope Eugenio Pacelli in Germany in 1917, doing just that. And he's just been in an audience with Kaiser Wilhelm II. So keep all that in mind when you read this, because this has literally been made divine law. Quote, let them remember that the world will never be able to rid itself of misery, sorrow, and tribulation. Quoting Pope Pius XI in 1937. The unsaid but definite sub-understanding meaning of this is they'll make sure that's the way things are around here. This is because the Catholics and the British nobility literally cannot survive without all these things in place. I think that's a brilliant, succinct way to put it. When you see the explosion of pornography, drugs, destruction of culture, burning of books, all of this medieval crap that's being pushed on us by the media, where's it coming from? Are they trying to get us addicted to evil so they can then destroy us? And I think about, a couple of years ago when I was spending so much time studying things like the Hand Bank. And when you consider, if you are in Australia at the time and you wanted to leave Australia and take your money with you, well, you couldn't. You weren't allowed to take Australian dollars out of Australia. But the Hand Bank could do that. And so if you were smart, you might say, oh, my buddy knows somebody in the Hand Bank. He can do that for you. And so they do, and it starts to work. And people put their money in the Hand Bank, and it's like, oh, I'm smarter than everybody else. I'm getting away with this. Well, until they just shut it down and everybody loses all their money, you got away with it. To me, that strikes me as this kind of a scheme, a Jesuitical, and yes, that's a word, a Jesuitical scheme to induce people into sin or evil in order to rob them or just get rid of them. Back to the text. Notice what the title of Pius XI's directive to the Catholics was, quote, on atheistic communism. Did you know that this is a play on words for what has always been the ideal situation in the slave master's perspective? That is, priests and kings rule the world, which traces right back to the Nephilim, and that's a topic I have not taken on, the Nephilim or Nesilim, and their double-headed eagle, which of course you will see all over the imperial world, from Russia to Germany to Prussia. The double-headed eagle, where all this came from. Atheistic refers to anyone who doesn't agree with the priest's part. Okay, so if you don't like the idea that there are priests, then you're an atheist. Okay? Communism refers to anyone who doesn't agree with the elite shall rule part. Obviously, if you don't like the emperor, then you must be a communist. Get it? It's kind of like their own little code. Next time you see the word communism, now you'll know why they throw that around so often as some kind of ultimate tarred and feathered kind of insult. When Pope Pius XI was elected, he flew to the banner of Pope Pius IX. Now, why would he do that, you might ask? To show his solidarity with Pius IX's practically foaming at the mouth diatribes against democracy and communism, published in the early to mid 1800s in what are called encyclicals. This was Pius XI's position he was taking throughout his time as Pope, which ended in February of 1939. In other words, democracy is bad. Well, what's that say to America? America is bad. To get an idea of what I'm talking about as to this position they were taking, you can see a number of sourced examples in my post lining, and this is a hot uh, link to another post where you can see various popes' quotes against Thomas Jefferson. Both Pius XI and 12th, but especially 12th, Pacelli, were not only involved in fomenting World War II, they were involved in profiting from it. There they are again. Pius XI, who had Pacelli negotiate the infamous Concordat with Hitler and Nazi Germany, Hitler was so on board with that idea that it was literally the first thing he did when he took power. In my husband's book, Scientology Roots, Chapter 13, The Matureya and Messiah Scam, he wrote about that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany were a British operation, and that British slave masters set up and financed Nazi Germany. The British slave masters used Nazi Germany during World War II to carry out genocide for the purpose of ethnic cleansing. But what they really meant was the removal of the holders of, quote, evil opinions, unquote. And here's a quote from Adolf Hitler: "I have the right to exterminate millions of individuals of inferior races which multiply like vermin." The man that Pacelli and his boss Pius XI were so in agreement with, Pius IX actually advocated for the extermination of evil opinions. Quote, "The welfare of human society itself altogether demand that we again stir up your pastoral solicitude to exterminate other evil opinions," unquote. What were those evil opinions? Quanta Cura, Pius IX's in 1864 encyclical, specifically promoted marking the following for condemnation, quote, "Liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty, which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whereby they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas whatsoever, either by word of mouth, by the press, or in any other way," unquote. Sound like the Bill of Rights to you? Of course it does. That's the point. Pius the 11th didn't like Catholic political parties because they, quote, "brought democracy into the church by the back door." That attitude by Pius the 11th and his 1800s predecessors is one of the most clear examples of that. When they say, quote, "communism," they really mean what happened in America. Democracy, or rule by the people, is what they're actually against. There's a lot more that could be said about this. I've already covered it in an article which is called "Why Psychiatry is More Religion Than Science." I look forward to delving into that. Okay, by the time Pacelli became Pope in early 1939, over half of Hitler's new Reich had become Catholics, including a quarter of the SS. This means that a huge number of Catholics knew about, supported, and even participated in the mass killings going on at the concentration camps. So, put another way, Hitler's words about these inferior races were startlingly right on point with these Catholic popes. They are inferior primarily because they have evil opinions that reject slave master society. You understand? What started happening on a massive scale in early 1939 when Pacelli ascended the papal throne? Stripping Jews of their assets, and then the massive imprisonment, experimentation, and the final solution, death. And there was the Vatican profiting by it. At the height of World War II, when all this illicit money was flowing like some kind of river of blood and life force to a vampire, in June of 1942, Pacelli created a bank, or rather a receiving organization called the Istituto per l'Opera de Religioni, the Institute for Religious Works, or IOR. The IOR was actually just a renaming of the Administration for Religious Works, which had been established by Leo XIII in 1887. It was located in a building at the Vatican named the Bastion of Nicholas V, who happens to have been the Pope that first legalized slavery, including enslaving anyone who was not Catholic or who refused to become Catholic. The same Pope that started the burning of women as witches. Pacelli assigned a man named Bernard Nogara to control the IOR. The IOR was one of the places where money was funneled as a result of the Nazis stripping the Jews of assets. In 1943 alone, over $100 million flowed into the coffers of the Vatican from that Concordat tax. What she's referring to is from the Concordat, which was earlier, I think in 33. The Vatican got some money promised to it as compensation for losing the Papal States, 60 years earlier. But that money, where did it come from? There's the question. Where did Italy get the money to pay the Vatican? Well, it's a very sad thing to think of. Where'd they get that $100 million? The Vatican had become a principal depository not only for black funds, but also top secret documents, including CIA files relating to the development of nuclear weapons. One of these documents, never declassified, surfaced in 2006 during discovery in Alperin versus Vatican Bank, a class action by Holocaust survivors who claimed the IOR was the repository of gold that had been stolen from them by the Nazi Croatian government. The Nazi money flowed in a great circle out of the Third Reich, through the Vatican, to Argentina, and back to, quote, democratic West Germany, through World Commerce Corporation. The source of the miraculous West German economic revival in the 1950s was the same money that had been stolen in the 1940s. And there's a footnote for that, and I encourage you to go through this carefully and check it. But so far, I've been convinced that these authors are on the right track. Despite the extraordinary secretive measures taken by Pacelli as Pope Pius XII, there do exist a few records here and there in the U.S. National Archives because of Nogara's transactions with the New York banks. Nogara was also instrumental in helping Pacelli secure support and future escape routes for the Nazis in South America. He and Pacelli also assisted with grooming dictators into place, together with the British and the U.S. sycophants, even as far back as 1934. And then in Brazil, you see Pacelli. Nogara helped hold Nazi money like Martin Bormann's money, and that gets really ugly, the worst it could be, actually. Nogara and Bormann happen to form a very important point where we have a distinct convergence of the Vatican, British, and their Anglophilic sycophants in the U.S. Isn't that a great name for them? The Anglophilic sycophants. Yeah, that's what Dulles is. That's what Bissell is. That's what all these disgusting. All right. Anglophilic sycophants. All aligned in profiting from World War II. Sworn testimony before the U.S. Senate indicates that during World War II, an organization did exist which was formed by Lord Shawcross of England and Mr. Hermann Abs of Germany to bring about a Magna Carta for the protection of foreign investments of World War II. Of course, that goes right back to Charles Higgins trading with the enemy and what he calls the fraternity, an organization indeed. It's been said that this organization helped protect certain financial interests exclusively and ergo aiding in laundering money seized by the Nazis during the war to Argentina, Nelson Rockefeller's territory during the war. Let's keep that in mind too. Nelson Rockefeller's South America was his. According to U.S. Treasury agent reports in 1941, when the U.S. entered the war, all of the branches of American banks in France under German control were closed, except two. The two banks had direct ties to Dr. Hermann Josef Abs of Deutsche Bank, the then financial advisor to Hitler's government. Those two banks were Morgan and Company, which was a Rothschild concern, and Chase of New York, which my family tree members, the Forgans and Halstead Freeman, were involved in. My meaning the author, of course. So it's the Forgans, I think, that ended up with the into something with the Scientology. We'll learn about that another time. The reason the above is mentioned is because, according to Nuremberg records, Hermann Abs's Deutsche Bank was the main conduit for laundering money into Nazi money into Argentina, which was done under the supervision of Martin Bormann, who was being assisted by both Nelson Rockefeller and Vatican agents, no less. Despite this blatant complicity, the American side of the war crimes investigation of Abs was dropped and never pursued again. Note, it has now been proven that the parent bank, Deutsche Bank, was also involved in financing the construction of the Auschwitz death camp and clearly shows that the money and property taken from the prisoners and the profits therein were laundered through this bank. Deutsche Bank had a long relationship with the British and Vatican and American slave masters and their bankers. In fact, around the time this branch in Colombia was founded by the Echevarias et al., another company based on oil exploration of Mesopotamia, came into being. See my posting in CIA Declassified Documents Library entitled Near East Operations, and I won't read all of it. The Echevarria family of Colombia, who had business offices in Panama as well, created a branch of that same Deutsche Bank. It was called Deutsche Bank Antioqueño. Deutsche Antioquia Bank, or Banco Alemán Antioqueño, was established in 1912 with head office at Bremen, but specifically to do business in Colombia. The local merchants of Medellin contributed about 25% of the capital, and German merchants, principally of Bremen, about 75%. This bank was part of the Schroeder Dulles and Vatican networks involved in laundering Nazi assets. In fact, it was investigated for just that, as these National Archives records show. And then there's a reference to her Schroeder's Bank article, which ought to be interesting. I have not read that yet. Banco Comercial Antioqueño, relationship to Adolf Held and Deutsche Antioquia Bank, 1949. Apparently a file in the National Archives. The son of one of these fine pillars of the Colombian Nazi asset laundering community, Fernando Echevarria, was personally audited and trained in Dianetics and Scientology techniques by CIA off-the-books asset L. Ron Hubbard in the 1950s. Many more of his family members got into Hubbard's little behavior modification day camp called Scientology, and some continue to support it to this day. As I understand it, Hermann Abs was appointed economic advisor by the British for the British zone of Germany, which is where we end up back at the World Commerce Corporation again, as they were one of the main corporations to profit from that particular monopolized position. A large amount of these ill-gotten assets they were stealing from multiple countries and its people during the World War II was moved after the war into the World Commerce Corporation, who then turned around and ever so benevolently doled out some pittances proportionately to the countries they had helped tear up in the first place. And the rest of what they needed, they made them take out loans. Loans with money stolen from their own fallen comrades and people's money. The Nazi money flowed in a great circle out of the Third Reich, through the Vatican, to Argentina, and back to, quote, democratic West Germany, through the World Commerce Corporation. The source of The miraculous West German economic revival in the 1950s was the same money that had been stolen in the 1940s. Have you ever heard of Valerian Lada Markovsky? Valerian, such an exotic name, was born in 1898 in Samarkand, Turkestan, the son of a czarist general. That makes him allied to the White Russians, just for the sake of where is he in our big picture. He became a commercial banker, and when he first went into the OSS, he was the special intelligence chief of the OSS Cairo. Colonel Valerian, codenamed Juniper, had come to Istanbul from OSS Cairo as Donovan's personal representative to help ensure that everything went well. He was the OSS station chief in Cairo and also one of the people slated to be dropped into Hungary. Valerian also happened to sit with Alan Dulles on the board of directors of the American branch of the British owned Schroeder Bank. Schroeder Bank was one of the oldest banks in the city of London. It was heavily involved in financially supporting the Third Reich. The director of Schroeder Bank in England at the time, F.C. Tierks, was also a director of the Bank of England, as was Charles Jocelyn Hambro, one of the original founders of our World Commerce Corporation we're investigating here. The address of the New York City branch of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corp. Was also the home of the infamous Pinkerton Detective Agency. Come on, give me a break. Yep, and you can see the picture there. Pinkerton National Detective Agency probably was the same building when they were quote unquote protecting President Lincoln. The address of the New York City branch of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation was also the home of the infamous Pinkerton Detective Agency. The fact that they had the same address, 57 Broadway, is verified in both declassified CIA docs and in a 2006 interview from the World Bank archives. And there's hot links for those documents. A word on Pinkertons. Pinkerton's was deep in bed with British intelligence, has been since the first formalization of it as a district office by William Melville. Dr. Clutterbuck's thesis specifically mentions that Melville was working with Pinkertons in the U.S. to run British intelligence operations in America. Alan Pinkerton and Pinkertons were undercover Scotland Yard in the U.S. Quote, Pinkertons proved to be extremely useful investigative tool that MPSB could utilize to carry out its inquiries in the United States. Pinkerton's business insignia was a wide open eye with the caption, "We never sleep." I don't think that wide open eye came through on this particular um, business insignia, but that one eye certainly says a lot, does it not? In another example of his duplicity, Pinkerton had the cover of being pro labor, yet after his death, under the helm of his sons, his agency still continued to operate under direct British intelligence supervision and continued its anti labor union stance. When William Melville entered the spy picture just a few years later in the early 1900s, Pinkertons under William Pinkerton began being used for the exact type of false flag operations Melville had been doing at home in England. A false flag operation is simply an action in which the perpetrator intends for the blame or credit to be placed on a different party. The term originally comes from the naval concept of flying another country's flag to deceive and confuse other ships. And you've seen my show on the USS Alabama, and that was, of course, how Raphael Sims was able to destroy a substantial part of the U.S. Merchant Marine by sailing up to it in a neutral flag and then opening the gun ports, running up the Confederate battle flag, and telling them they had to surrender. Agent provocateurs were planned planted and incited arranged lot riots in order to discredit unions and justify police crackdowns. These type of activities continued all the way up to the 1930s when the La Follette Committee began to investigate it. So, sharing an address with Pinkertons, Valerian Ladomarkowski, both prior, during, and after World War II, sat on the board of Schroeder's Bank, as were several other key personnel of World War II that engaged in cloaking Nazi assets and money laundering of stolen Jewish and others' property taken under the guise of wartime. Alan Dulles, from his apartment at Herrengasse 23 in Bern, Switzerland, presided over the European Theater of Intelligence Operations as the OSS chief. He continued the tight relationship with his City of London masters as well as his fellow Schroeder directors, such as Valerian. Apparently, according to a report by Swiss intelligence chief Colonel Roger Masson, Dulles referred to his apartment as a financial research unit. Kurt Schroeder of Schroeder's Bank, a member of the Circle of Friends of the Reichsfuhrer, after setting up yet another special account for Heinrich Himmler in Sternbank, was promoted to SS Brigadeführer by Himmler. This was at the time that Alan Dulles sat on Schroeder's board of directors. Through the German brokerage account company Albert and Westdirk and Dulles' legal firms, Sullivan and Cromwell, an impenetrable web of companies laundered the concealed SS assets, beginning to see why Hambro would come to be on the board of the World Commerce Corporation. I thought you might. At the other end of things, the Vatican end, the Schroeder Bank House had extensive influence in Latin America, particularly through its New York, London, and Hamburg offices. Valerian often traveled to South America despite his other hats as head of intelligence OSS Cairo. And there's a ship log with his name on it. Just 6 months later, after Valerian's strange little side jaunt from Cairo to Buenos Aires in October 1940, the FBI had learned of the whole Rookwanderer business, which is referred to in another essay in the book with a hot link there. Then they raided and seized documents that proved that Chase National and others had clearly acted as agents of the German government without informing the Department of State, as was required by law. In other words, they violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA, which we've talked about so much in connection with General Flynn. Okay, let me just go back and make sure you understand, if you haven't yet run into the Rückwanderer business. And what that refers to is German for uh, somebody that goes home, a, uh, a person who's living in a foreign country that decides to go home to their native country, and that's wandering back, Rückwandering, to the home. Well, that was a term used to allow German people in America or other countries to buy German marks at a discount and thereby support the Third Reich. It was an evasion of what really was a scheme to support the foreign government, makes them a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1939. So you see what that is. It's the FBI. Yay, Hoover. In October 1940, found that it was Chase that was running the scheme. Now, Chase, of course, is Rockefeller. So Rockefeller is acting as a agent for Nazi Germany in facilitating the Rückwanderer German currency scheme. You see, this is you can't get around the fact that the Rockefellers and the Schroeder Bank and the Nazis are all working together. This is where World Commerce Corporation comes in after the war to consolidate the loot. So what happens after the FBI says, "Aha, we've caught you, Chase Bank"? Well, the Justice Department moved to prosecute in 1941, which clearly they could have. However, on June the 9th, 1942, FBI Director Hoover was informed that after consultation with Matias Correa, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, New York, our favorite district, the U.S. Attorney General Francis Biddle, parentheses, who had only been elected September 5th, 1941. And I have to say, I don't think that attorneys general get elected, so maybe a minor error there by our author, appointed or perhaps approved by the Senate, if that's the case. Anyway, Francis Biddle, the U.S. Attorney General, new on the job. Remember, Robert Mueller, new on the job, FBI, 9/11. Anyway, Francis Biddle refused to prosecute Chase. Allegedly, what had happened was that Chase's lead lawyer threatened to reveal our Army, FBI, and Navy sources and methods in open court. Well, we can't have that, can we? So we better shut the whole thing down. Too bad. Don't get to investigate Chase Bank. Just after the war, the FBI uncovered key documentation of links between Dulles and Schroeder in New York and a deliberate diversion of IG Farben and Stahlwerke's assets, steelworks. But they were hamstrung again in bringing these men to justice. This, even though Mr. Pearson, you know Pearson, right, a journalist, had been leaked the information, and his broadcast of April 30th, 1945 detailed that, quote, a series of secret cables sent by General William Donovan of the OSS to Russell Forgan, former Chicago banker now in Paris, is intriguing other U.S. officials. Donovan wired Forgan to interrogate directors of the giant Nazi cartel IG Farben, now seized by the U.S. Army. This is the company which collaborated with Standard Oil of New Jersey and the Aluminum Corporation of America to keep vitally important patents for synthetic rubber, magnesium, and high octane gasoline from the American public at a time when it was essential to use those patents for war. One cable from Donovan to Forgan in Paris reads, quote, I've already asked you to send names of IG Farben now in custody. From now on, these men should be kept from one another, particularly when the interrogation begins. Files of IG Farben should be seized and sent to Paris at once in our custody. This is most important, essential that we keep control of these men, unquote. Do you see why? They might talk and reveal just how faked and orchestrated this whole war with Nazi Germany really was. And those files contained the proof. After the war, Operation Gladio funding. Valerian and the Schroeder Dulles banking network forms another tie to our Vatican money laundering network, with big cuts going to the Pope's Bank, the IOR. And this continued after the war as part of Operation Gladio, with Valerian serving as liaison officer to the Italian resistance, one of the first Gladio cells, which was in Rome. Resistance in quotes. The Operation Gladio was initially financed with Nazi assets and then by drug trafficking profits. The same Vatican bank we discussed earlier, the IOR, was then used to launder this drug money during the Vatican CIA MI6 drug route buildup period of their new drug routes. You can read more about that here, and there's a link. Plus, there are several other posts concerning the whole drug trade business you can check out as well. But as I have also recently attained corporate records documenting a number of the shell corporations they were using to do this. Please see this post. This is also what the World Commerce Corporation was a front for, funneling drug trafficking profits. How did that get started? And what happened to the Martin Bormann money? I'll answer the Bormann part first because that's actually directly related to Operation Gladio activity. In 1952, the same year and the same time that Klaus Barbie transitioned from Argentina to Bolivia with his new name of Klaus Altmann, important Nazi figure Martin Bormann's money was released, and all those lovely men working together had arranged to deposit $100 million cash and another 40 million in diamonds in 40 Swiss banks in preparation for what the Nazis were now assigned to do in Central and South America. They put the money in Juan Perón's dead wife's name, which is a very sick twist since she hated these people, and Juan Perón, in parentheses, Vatican man Licio Gelli's contact. And we know all about Licio Gelli from Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, which we read last year. Remember, Pope Pacelli and his man Nogaro of the Vatican IOR Bank were who had arranged to hold Bormann's money, and now they wanted to use it for Operation Gladio's heinous acts against humanity. We're looking at the use of more than $500 million, stolen from all those people they killed in World War II, now being used by Vatican and British slave master networks to do more horrific things out of Central and South America. They didn't exactly want any of this known, and the next year, the three men who knew, but were not high level slave master assets, were all killed. Juan Duarte, the courier, Heinrich Dorge, an aide to Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was Skorzeny's father-in-law, who had been president of Hitler's Reichsbank. Rudolf Freude, Nazi banker who knew the locations of the money, was poisoned. Klaus Barbie and Otto Skorzeny would then busy themselves helping to form death squads such as the Angels of Death in Bolivia, the Anti-Communist Alliance in Argentina, the AAA, and in Spain with Operation Gladio head Stefan de la Quiaye, the Guerrillas of Christ the King. Gelli was already mixed up in Gladio. See the history section of this post for more about that. Operation Gladio and drug trafficking, and this post, their network of shell corporations. Okay, now I'll talk about the World Commerce Corporation and its director's role in the continued financing they needed after the initial startup using Nazi money to run black ops. Operation Gladio all over the world against anyone who would oppose British/Vatican rule. The drug trafficking source. This actually began with Paul Lionel Edward Helliwell was head of the OSS Special Intelligence in Kunming, China during World War II. Helliwell gets an idea. We've talked about this with George Webb, the Helliwell Plan, right? His idea was to provide steady shipments of opium to Chinese addicts to raise funds for, quote, combating communism, unquote. Of course, that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was to fund black intelligence operations throughout Southeast Asia, subverting and attempting to overthrow any governments who did not want to get on board with the slave master way train. Note, many authors attempt to pin all this just on America. This is disingenuous at best, outright propaganda at its worst. This was a British intelligence Vatican plan. The OSS and later the CIA were simply being run by their sycophants in America. To say this was America's fault is just dead wrong. Helliwell began by presenting his idea to the head of the OSS, General Wild Bill Donovan, who discussed it with Allen Dulles and their British overlord, MI6 SOE man, William Stevenson, who in turn discussed it with his boss, Tony Keswick, whose family fortune founded the firm Jardine and Matheson in China. Just happened to be one of the largest opium dealers. They were all delighted with the idea and began funneling money to him for opium purchases. Selling opium, capital idea. Pictures of Donovan, Dulles, and Stevenson. Let us Be thankful for the revelations, the work that other people have done, even anonymously, to help us understand the third force, the synarchy, the hidden hand, and the Black Pope working together to destroy everybody else. The evil that they see is actually us.